right, gang, welcome back. The next video we're going to go over is what I call the fifth pillar, and that is inflation. Now, when I first started investing in real estate, inflation wasn't that big a deal. I first started doing my first deal in 2005, not that big a deal. Even when I started getting really into it in 17 and 18 and 19, nobody was really thinking about inflation. But then COVID happened, and of course, inflation got on everybody's mind. So I started doing a big deep dive into this. And so the books we're going to reference, a little nerdy, but one is A History of Money and Banking in the United States by Murray S. Rothbard. For those of you like to geek out in economics, this is a complete geek out. It has a very libertarian bent. Murray Rothbard was a huge libertarian, but I love the founding fathers. I love about the revolution, stories about the Revolutionary War. So I ate this book up. And then The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio, he founded Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund on earth. His book's Principles, Changing World Order have really affected how I see the investing world. So by the end of the call, you're going to understand how real estate does not work. Real estate works, but the fact that we're in an inflationary environment, it is your best defense against inflation. So using leverage, using hard assets right now, this is the only place where upper middle class Americans can win. Otherwise, everybody's in danger for inflation. So for those of you guys who may or may not be history buffs, people like me, if you guys do understand examples of hyperinflation, what are common examples are the Weimar Republic, that's Germany before Hitler took over. After World War I, before the Nazis, Germany had a bunch of war reparations to pay for World War I. So what did they do? They just printed a bunch of currency and paid it to the French and English. What did that do? That made the currency, that inflated the currency, made it basically worthless. Another modern example is Zimbabwe, where their currency went to absolute zero. They experienced a major hyperinflation. The reason this guy, you see a bunch of cash on a wheelbarrow. In the Weimar Republic, I think it was called the Deutschmark, but the currency was at such a level of worthlessness, it made sense to burn it for fire, then trade it. And you might be thinking, hey, that only happens in broke, poor countries, right? No, absolutely. It's happened on North America. It's happened in the United States at least 3 times. And as you might have noticed, I'm a patriot. I love this country, and I believe the math shows it. We're the most prosperous nation in human history. But that being said, our history with inflation, it just simply isn't the best. And I'm going to go do a quick history lesson, helping you guys understand that. And also helping you understand why it matters as a modern day investor. So the question is, like you see on the media, inflation. But does inflation hurt everyone? Is a question I started to ask myself. And are there people who use inflation to win? And I'm going to tell a story about how people who use inflation to win. North America, the colonies, the United States, we don't have a great history with money printing. The way money printing happened in the colonies was this. This is a picture of the Massachusetts militia. In the 1700s, what would happen every spring is the Massachusetts militia would gather together and go raid. They would go raid the French-Canadian colonies. And the way the soldiers would get paid was bounty. And then a couple raids happened, and the colonists didn't win. They got beat by the French Canadians. And so then you had a bunch of surly soldiers walking back, wondering how are they going to get paid. What were their options? Except not getting paid or attack their own home colony. And so the politicians legitimately being terrified of the fact that, this militia would become a bunch of bandits raiding our colony, said, hey, we got to pay these guys somehow. But we don't have any gold or silver to pay these guys. So what did they do? They started printing paper money, which was basically an IOU to the soldiers saying, hey, man, you can take this piece of paper, this IOU, and it'll trade like gold and silver. And so that worked for a little bit. But like every example of money printing in the United States, once the politicians are able to do it once, they do it a lot, and then they do it too many times. And the militia kept raiding and kept losing. And so it created a vicious cycle where the Massachusetts colony printed too much paper money. And so paper money became worthless. And it happened, a few other examples in the colonies, but I'm not going to get into it outside the scope of this. But it happened so much that the British made printing paper money by colonial governments illegal. That's how big of a problem it was. Now, so the Revolutionary War comes up. It's like everybody's a loser in inflation. We fought the Revolutionary War with a continental. This currency became worthless. So this gets lost in the history of the Revolutionary War, but no one talks about how we paid for the war. And so here was the economic dilemma. You're going to rebel against the most powerful government in the world and create a government committed to not taxing. How do you fight a long war of attrition to pay for it? So think about it. The colonists, part of the reason they revolted was because they had to pay taxes, taxation without representation. So how is the new government going to pay for the soldiers, pay for the war without taxing? And then the only way to win the war was a long war of attrition. So how are you going to pay for the soldiers over a 7-year war? It was a very interesting economic dilemma. Here's what they came up with. They went back to like the Massachusetts colony. We're going to print money to do that. So they came up with the Continental dollar. So here's just why I find the economic history of the Revolutionary War fascinating. How do you buy equipment and pay for soldiers when you don't have any gold and silver and you're broke? Great Britain had stores and stores of gold. The US had one option, like I said, make up a currency not redeemable by gold and silver and start printing notes and see if anybody would trade with you. So the Continental was backed by nothing, just the good faith of the Continental Congress, who nobody was sure they would win the war. And so once again, what happens when politicians have the option to just print money? They just do it too much. They went on a spending spree and they printed over $2 million worth of Continentals. And so I don't know if you've heard the expression, worthless as a Continental. That's where that comes from. There's example number one of where we've had hyperinflation in the United States at the beginning of the country. And so here's another thing when you think about the founding fathers, and this was fascinating for Murray Rothbard, but how do history teachers teach? Who do they say were the debtors back in the day and who were the lenders? So, and then who does this guy say debtors are and lenders are? And so the basic high school education, history teacher is going to say, hey, rich people are the lenders and the poor people are the debtors. And that's why we have class wars. That's why we have class conflicts. Let's ask ourselves, is this even true? And this is a quote from Murray Rothbard's book. This was earth-shattering to me. And I'm going to read, so it's going to take a little long, but one intriguing aspect of both the Massachusetts Land Bank and other inflationary colonial schemes is that they were advocated and lobbied for some of the wealthiest merchants and land speculators in the revolutionary colony. So what does that mean? John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, was rich and always advocating and lobbying for inflationary schemes. Older historians assumed that debtors were largely poor agrarians and creditors were wealthy merchants. That means the lenders were wealthy merchants and the borrowers were just poor farmers. And that therefore, the poor farmers were the main sponsors of the inflationary schemes. That is not what actually happened in history. But of course, there are no rigid classes of debtors and creditors. Most, indeed, wealthy merchants and land speculators are often the heaviest debtors. If you look at all the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, the big landowners, they were land rich, but cash poor. So they were always going into debt to find liquidity, and they're always using their land as collateral. So wealthy merchants and land speculators are often the heaviest debtors. Later historians have demonstrated that members of the latter group were the main sponsors of inflationary paper. So what does that mean? It means the rich people are generally the debtors. And who do they want to really, and who do they like to use to create cheap money? The government. So that was mind-boggling to me because I grew up, my high school, what I learned in my high school was that poor people were borrowers and rich people were lenders. And that's just not how it works. Like I just asked, who were the founding fathers? Debtors or creditors? They were the debtors. Robert Morris, he personally financed the revolution himself. He was paying soldiers with personal IOU notes by the end of the war. That's how broke the government was, that Robert Morris stepped in and personally backed the United States government. But that's how we bought the ships. That's how we bought the arms. This is how we survived a 7-year war of attrition. But here's what the founding fathers knew. Here's what wealthy people knew back then. Here was the trade. They would take a continental dollar and they would buy land and they would get title and deed to the land. That was the trade. Now, here's what would happen. The continental was worthless, but what did these guys still have? They still had title to the land and they still had title to the real estate. And so if you read two of Kiyosaki's books, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and Conspiracy of the Rich, this was fascinating to me. Kiyosaki writes at an 8th grade level. Murray Rothbard writes at a graduate level. And so I had always thought what Kiyosaki said was interesting. When I saw it backed up by actual historical books, I was like, wow, this is interesting. And then I started thinking about it in my own life. So here's my own personal story and experience with this. So you guys know I went to West Point. I studied in-depth politics of morality, ethics, strategy, tactics of war. I knew about the Revolutionary War, Napoleonic War, Civil War, World War I, World War II. But no one ever in any of the history I studied talked about how the wars were paid for. And then I went to war myself and I saw no such things as budgets. If I wanted to go shoot, if I wanted to go train, I just picked up a bunch of ammo and went and trained. And I was the only guy doing this. Both wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost at least $2.4 trillion. And I never asked myself this question, like, who was paying for me to eat? Who was paying for me to sleep? Who was paying for my equipment? Who was paying for my helicopter rides? Who was paying for the airplanes I was jumping out of? And I knew a lot about the tactical and strategic information about how wars were fought, but I never asked myself, like I said, how was everything paid for? And standing armies are very expensive. Food, shelter, equipment, pensions. Armies are not cheap. How do governments pay for it? By inflating the currency. This is really as old as the Romans. And so then I started asking myself, what's going on here? Does everybody get hurt in an inflationary environment? So let's check it out. First example is we beat the greatest country on earth to get our independence. So we didn't get hurt by inflation. Some people at that time got hurt for sure. Generally, this is how government works. These are the greatest tax rebellions in history. So the Magna Carta was a tax rebellion in response to Richard Lionheart's desire to fight the Crusades. He needed to pay for the wars and he needed to tax people. He couldn't print money back then. English Civil War, rebellion after the King's spending after the 30 Years' War. Declaration of Independence, tax rebellion from Americans for the British were trying to pay for the French and Indian War. Declaration of the Rights of Man. The French Revolution was a rebellion against King Louis's extravagant spending on our Revolutionary War and some other wars he wanted to fight. But generally, I started to recognize that inflationary cycles revolve around wars. Every example of extreme inflation in our country is revolving around a war. We had an inflationary cycle and depression after the Revolutionary War. Inflationary cycle and depression after War of 1812. Same thing after the Civil War. Same thing after World War I, World War II. Modern day example is the Vietnam War. We went up the gold standard to pay for the Vietnam War. So here are the options governments have if they want to fight wars. They can tax, but as I just went through, that causes rebellions. They can borrow, but lenders aren't going to lend if they don't know it's a sure thing that you're going to win the war. And 3, they can inflate the currency. That's the easiest option. So generally, it's a combination of options 2 and 3. They'll borrow from borrowers who will lend to them, and then they'll also print a bunch of money. So here is usually the historical pattern. Government or society wants something it can't pay for right now. They're not willing to tax, can't find lenders, so they inflate the currency, pay for the war. Then they let society deal with the inflation, generally with a boom bust cycle or a depression. And it's clear that over the last 2,000 years, inflating the currency, there's winners or losers. Not everybody's a loser in this game. Now, here's what's interesting about our modern day, is it used to be only hot wars that governments would try to inflate the currency with. Now, any emergency the population would tolerate is what governments will do. That means wars, economic downturns, pandemics, any other societal boogeymen. So big government, United States, no war, no problem. 70s, war on drugs. Our time, my time, war on terror. In the 2020, war on COVID. So here's a new pattern. The government's never going to let a good emergency go to waste. They don't want to tax or to pay for the emergency. Who would have handled their taxes going up to pay for COVID? They can't find lenders, or they want to pay lenders back with inflated currency. So here's what they do. They inflate the currency, pay for the emergency, initiate the inflationary cycle, let society deal with the consequences of the inflation. And then I'm almost done with the history, but inflationary, it's not new and it's not temporary. And it's both political parties. And so I'm going to hit a little bit of politics here. No big deal. But Bush doubled the national debt. Obama rose the debt in his 8 years by 3/4. Trump added another third to the debt. Biden in his time, another 10%. Money printing is a both party problem. It's not like Republicans bring in austerity and keep everything maintained. And so generally the average money supply increase is at 8%. So you can expect 8% inflation. Now, our goal isn't to win a political argument, say I'm a Democrat, we're right, I'm a Republican, we're right. That's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to win. Suckers try to win arguments, non-suckers try to win. And real estate is your greatest weapon against inflation because there are winners and losers in inflation. Like I've already said, people in the Revolutionary War, we won. The North in the Civil War, they inflated the currency like crazy. They won. And so now we're going to go to Ray Dalio's book. And it's a 400-page book. I'm going to take you the last 50 pages and speed it up. Recommendations for the book. But here's the bottom line. Here's the 3 biggest risks for investors because of inflation. Number one is portfolios won't provide enough returns to meet their spending needs. So what does that mean? It means you have an investment portfolio, and let's say your dividends are 8% a year, but inflation's at 9%, you're losing money. You're in a bad spot. Number two, straight up portfolios are ruined. So if you had a investment portfolio in pre-Nazi Germany with the Weimar Republic, hyperinflation destroyed your entire portfolio if it was in paper assets. Same thing in Zimbabwe. And number three is that a large share of their wealth is taking away through taxation, government redistribution, and mostly inflation. So that's, as people who are trying to become wealthy and financially free, those are the three biggest risks for us. Here's something interesting. As inflation gets worse, hard assets go up in value while paper assets go down in value. And so here was recommendations from Dalio. Here's what he thinks is going to happen in the future is debts held in reserve currencies are growing too fast to be paid back with hard money. It's not like the United States government's going to pay back its debt in gold. Money's going to be printed to service that debt, which further perpetuates the inflationary issue. And then here's the real problem. To keep the economy greased and moving, interest rates are going to be held low, below inflationary rates and growth rates. So one way to stop inflation, as we've seen, is to raise the interest rate. That slows everything down. It puts some more gas in the tank. But even though they've raised interest rates a lot in 2023, 2024, Dalio's contention is that governments over the long term are not going to be able to sustain high interest rates. So they're going to lower interest rates while inflation, so say interest rates are at 5, inflation's at 8, that means the currency is going to get hammered and inflation is going to keep going up. And so this was particularly interesting from Dalio, and particularly if you've thought I've been droning on in this video, pay attention again. This is the big risk is not that debtors are going to default on their debt. It's not going to be like the global financial crisis that everybody's defaulting on their debt. It's that the creditors' assets will lose value and that their returns will be less than inflation. So what does that mean? For example, if you get a 30-year mortgage from a bank and your interest rate's 4 and inflation's 9, that means you're paying that bank back with worthless currency. That's why my program works. That's why single family residential real estate works. It gets you access to cheap credit that is 30-year fixed, and there's no way the lender is going to get the value back. So hopefully I'm going to stress that one more time. Creditors' assets will lose value. That means if you're a lender and you charge somebody a 5% interest rate and they pay back in 5 years, 5%, but inflation's been at 10, that creditor has lost a lot of value on that loan. So very interesting. It's not going to be the debtors that get hammered. It's going to be the creditors. I just went over the 30-year mortgage. The 30-year mortgages helps us get on the winning side of that, getting on the winning side of inflation. Savers or losers. If you're saving cash, it's getting destroyed by inflation. So here's the deal. What to do in light of this? Number one, protect against drop in financial assets. Protect against, what does that mean? Be in assets that don't get hammered if there's a dip in the stock market. Number two, protect against the devaluation of the dollar. What does that mean? It's you have to have some inflationary hedge. That's what real estate is. Here's why it's a hedge. Inflation works for us. You use leverage, you only have 20% down. As the house appreciates 5% a year, you get a higher and higher return on that 20% down. And now if you would put that cash in the bank, there's no way it's keeping up with inflation. But with a house, since you have leverage on it, and since inflation is going to drive up the price of that asset, you're winning. Same thing with rents. Rents are going to continue to go up with inflation. So your small 20 to 25% down payment, it is what it is, but you're going to get such a lever off that amount of money. That's how you beat inflation, because your asset values rise and your rents rise. And your mortgage payment is the same. This is how the cash flow gap opens up. Is every year you raise the rent, your mortgage payment stays the same, but your rent payment keeps growing. And number three is to be more productive than the rise in interest rates. Generally, the solution to everything is be more productive. What you got to do is be more productive than the interest rates. And also to do that, you need to raise your financial IQ. And so we're going to get into this later in the course, but your number one job as an investor is to clearly articulate, develop, improve, and act on your decision-making criteria. You have to consider inflation on any long-term investment that you're making. That's why I've droned on in this video for so long. And so your investing criteria has to be able to account for and leverage the certainty of inflation. I hope what I've shown to you is it's not maybe there's going to be inflation, but it's certain there's going to be inflation. And so then also remember, you have the 4 pillars. You have 4 ways to win. Like I always just went through. inflation is going to help your asset appreciate. You're either going to win or win big, a barbell approach. And so you got to look at every house you buy as just putting an inflation sale in the air. That's why you use leverage. And that's why you get 10 to 20 assets. So all of those assets can appreciate. Number 2, cash flow. I went through the cash flow gap, how that opens up. As rents rise each year, your mortgage payment stays the same. And so your cash flow grows each and every year. Number 3, leverage. This all works because of leverage. Because remember, the wealth transfer, just like in the Revolutionary War, it's going to go from creditors to debtors. So whoever the bank's lending you, the wealth transfer is going to you because there's no way that the interest rates they're charging, that they're not losing to inflation. And like I said, it's the American way to use leverage with inflated currencies to become wealthy. That's how the founding fathers did it. And number 4 is pay less in taxes. There's so many tax advantages to real estate that you're able to keep more of your own money. So I'm going to end the video with this. Here's the trade. Just like the founding fathers, they took a worthless Continental and they traded it for title and deed to real estate. You're going to take a worthless dollar that we know is getting inflated, that we know is losing value every day, and you're going to trade it for a title and deed to a single family residence that people need to live in for the next 30 years. So it's the same play that the founding fathers used. It's the same play we're going to use. So that's what I got for the inflation video. If you're a history buff, I've done this talk a few times. Most of the history people love it. But like I said before, your investing criteria has to account for inflation, and you have to know a little about inflation. So see you on the next video.